I'm Marshall Kozloff, and this is Arsenal of Democracy.
Never before has our American civilization been in such danger as now. Danger against which we must prepare. But we well know that we cannot escape danger by crawling into bed and pulling the covers over our heads. We must be the great arsenal of democracy.
My guests today on the show are Kroenig and Dan Negrea. They have a new book out. It's called We Win, They Lose, all about the idea that despite the past 8 years of foreign policy tumult, you actually have seen emerge a new consensus on foreign policy for the American right moving forward. They argue that you've actually seen a merger of Trump foreign policy ideals with those of Ronald Reagan's presidency. In this conversation, we discuss everything from the arsenal of democracy, of course, to also the idea that isolationism is not inherently tied to the conservative program and all the different paths moving forward.
Is the number one threat facing the country climate change, as the Biden administration says? Or is it, as Dan and I think, the threat from the Chinese Communist Party? And if it's the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party, then giving away one of our greatest strengths, our energy security, in order to hand a win to China when it comes to EVs and these other technologies where China is basically trying to dominate the market, not because it cares about climate change per se, but because it wants to dominate 21st century technology, and our climate change policies are playing into China's hand. And so we argue that doesn't make sense.
I hope you all enjoy the conversation. Kroenig and Dan Negrea, welcome to Arsenal of Democracy.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat. So, Matt, let's throw the big opening question to you first here. The central idea in your book is that despite all of the tumult of the past 8 years, we really have come to some sort of consensus on the right within the conservative movement on foreign policy at a broad principles level. You refer to this as a Trump-Reagan fusion. Explain what you mean by that.
Yes, well, at first, Dan and I decided to write this book because we thought that the country needs a new national security strategy. It's an incredibly dangerous time with a war in Europe, war in the Middle East, China becoming more aggressive. And so that's what we aim to provide in this book, a kind of national security strategy for the next Republican administration. But then as we got into it, we realized that, this central argument of a Trump-Reagan fusion was maybe different than the conventional wisdom, because you do hear arguments that the party's very divided between a kind of internationalist Reaganite wing and a more isolationist Trumpian wing. And Dan and I came to the conclusion and argued that actually on the major issues, the party is united and is different from progressives on the other side of the aisle. So in military policy, the idea of peace through strength, I think, unites the policy. On economic policy, the idea of free and fair trade. On values, the idea of American exceptionalism. And then we go through specific issues as well: China, Iran, North Korea. And so I think there are some differences in the party, what to do over Ukraine, for example, but I think many people kind of obsess over those differences and miss the underlying consensus, really uniting the party across the major issues.
Dan, the two of you in the opening chapter spend a lot of time articulating what American interests actually are, because zooming out, oftentimes in the media, this debate will be basically turned into a debate over interests versus values. I think in your attempt to create a fusion between these competing, let's say, narrative instincts, you argue that there actually are very defined interests that we could focus on. Talk us through some of those that you've sort of come to an accord on.
Yeah, I think this is actually an extremely important point, and thank you for asking me, Marshall. But first of all, thank you for having us here. Very often discussions on what America's foreign policy should be is misguided because it doesn't start with the most important thing, which is, what is the interest of the American people in what happens in a certain part of the world or in a certain crisis? So just to take an example on Ukraine, you hear the Biden administration talk about how Putin's invasion of Ukraine is a threat to democracy around the world, and we cannot allow a dictator to defeat a democratic country. This is not where the discussion should start. The discussion should start with what is the interest of the United States, what is good for the American people regarding Europe in general and Ukraine in particular. So Matt and I thought this was very important to put in the book way up front. 6 interests, and we divide them into vital and important, and the vital ones are interests for which the American administration at any one time should be prepared to go to war. And that is defending the homeland, preventing nuclear proliferation, threats to our allies, not allowing another power, a hostile power, to dominate a part of the world that is crucially important to the United States. But then there are 2 other interests for which the United States should not go to war, and one is trade, and the other is democracy. And it doesn't mean that we don't pursue those interests, but we pursue them with other tools of statecraft.
And Matt, something I'm curious about, you two frame this debate or this case for this fusion around the construct of conservatism versus progressivism. Obviously, you can speak to the values that you and others like Jonathan Haidt argue, like define progressivism versus conservatism. But I'm curious how you see these internal awkward dynamics play out within the Biden administration. So, for example, if you look at, let's say, tariffs on EVs, you could see on the one hand the argument that, hey, that's the Biden administration embracing great power competition with China. You could see this idea that actually we're going to prioritize America's domestic political economy and manufacturing base over, let's say, a world where we have millions and millions of cheap quality EVs, but they're coming from China. And you actually within the administration saw a bit of actual debate around that, prioritizing climate change over, once again, domestic manufacturing capabilities. So how do you understand these competing instincts within the Biden administration that don't quite squarely fit into a typical left-right articulation of what's happening here?
Yes, well, this was one of the books that was most interesting for me to research and to think about, because I'd never seen anyone lay out kind of what is a conservative foreign policy, how is that different from a progressive foreign policy. And so Dan and I did try to start with some fundamental principles from Sam Huntington and Jonathan Haidt and others, and then build up from that. If that's your worldview, how do you view America's role in the world? How do you view the international security environment? And essentially, we argue that Republicans, kind of grounded in religious tradition and otherwise, see the world as a dangerous place, and that the job of U.S. foreign policy is to advance American interests. Whereas progressives, with a worldview more heavily shaped by the European Enlightenment, think more that the job of the U.S. government is to cooperate with other countries to make the world a better place. So kind of a simple overview, but you can go into more detail in the book. So that was helpful for me to lay that out. And again, I think it should be interesting to readers. But you're right that there is a tension within the Biden administration. And I think part of that is that there is still a center in U.S. foreign policy. There is still a lot of agreement across the parties. And Dan and I talk about that in the book. But that Republicans are often kind of pulled by their conservative wing and Democrats by their progressive wing. And that does lead to these consistent differences on international organizations, use of force, and other things. So I think essentially, just one more line to actually answer your question. Sorry. I think where you see these differences is where Biden has kept some of the Trump policies in place, like competition with China, I think is where they've done some of their best work. I think where they have been taken off track by their progressive wing on things like climate or the war in Gaza is where I would give the Biden administration lower marks.
And Dan, here is what's pretty important here from a not bearing the lead perspective. Could you just articulate the ways that you two see Trump and Reagan ideas fusing together in some form of moving forward agenda that folks could focus on?
Yeah, thank you, Marshall. That's really the the core of the book. This is the central argument of the book. And what Matt identified were three of the most important ways in which Reagan ideas and Trump ideas come together. And the first one is peace through strength. In a way, you can think about the four tools of statecraft that people put in the DIME idea, diplomacy, ideas, military, and economic. So if you look at the military thing, it's peace through strength. And it is something that Reagan advocated. And that in the Trump administration, we saw it in action, implemented more recently. And Ambassador O'Brien, the most recent national security advisor of former President Trump, wrote an article in Foreign Affairs, very important article outlining what the policy should be in a Trump 2 administration. And he starts with the return of peace through strength. So that's a very important thing. The second element, and that's the economic part of the DIME thing, is the move from free trade to fair trade. It is a misconception that the Republican Party was always a free trade party and Trump was a discontinuity. And actually, Matt and I are showing in the article on trade how Reagan was not shy at all to use tariffs and quotas and tough negotiations, even with allies, when the interests of the American people demanded that. And then going to the ideas part, it's American exceptionalism, which was something that Reagan believed in to his core. It was central, the shining city on the hill and all that. And it is reflected in former President Trump's idea of America first. To put America first, America has to be good and has to be worth putting first. So this would be the three areas in which we are seeing Reagan ideas and Trump ideas coming together and actually being applied in the recent Trump administration policies.
And Matt, as we look back on Reagan's legacy, putting aside straightforward policy debates and then political dynamics, I think something that was so useful about Reagan's presidency and his conception of his role within the conservative movement was just an ability to communicate simple ideas, simple articulations that express something bigger, which is very much summed up in the title of the book, We Win, They Lose. So can you do two things here? One, could you articulate what we win, they lose meant in the context of the 1980s? What does that actually mean in the context of 2020's America, updating that idea for the present world and our own geopolitical challenges?
Yes, well, the quote comes from Reagan, and he was asked by one of his advisors, what's your policy going to be toward the Soviet Union? This was on the campaign. And he said, well, it's simple. Some might say it's simplistic, but it's this. We win, they lose. And so kind of shocking at the time, the prevailing U.S. foreign policy toward the Soviet Union was détente, the idea that the United States was in decline, the Soviet Union was rising. We'd try to lock in a stable relationship through arms control agreements. And Reagan didn't buy it. He thought that created an unacceptable moral equivalency between the United States and the free world on one hand and the Soviet Union and its captive nations on the other. And he also thought that the United States had underlying strengths, the Soviet Union had real weaknesses, and if we took the gloves off and forced them to compete, that we could win the Cold War, not just manage it. And he was right. After 2 terms of office, he succeeded in bringing the Cold War to a close. And so Dan and I argue that that should be the inspiration for this new Cold War with communist China and other revisionist dictators. And the Biden administration says that they want to responsibly manage the competition with China. And Dan and I think that's the wrong way forward, that just like Reagan in the first Cold War, we should aim to win this Cold War. And we argue that essentially that means getting to a place where the Chinese government no longer has the will and or the ability to threaten America's vital interests. because that's the problem right now. China has the will and the desire and the capability to threaten our vital interests. And we should lay out a number of pathways where we could get to a place where that is no longer the case. And we argue that that would be victory in this new Cold War.
Dan, I think Matt's articulation of the rhyming of Reagan and Trump here is interesting, but also awkward, in the sense of this question of America being in decline versus America being this country that is in a strong position. A key tenet of Trumpism ever since 2015 really has been this idea that America is on the decline, that America's elites have weakened the country. How do you merge both the need to once again focus on our strength areas with the fact that if you're looking at Reagan and Trump gets there through this very much decline-centric narrative in opposition to Reagan's rhetorical belief that the country could be successful and it was in a much stronger position than folks would think it was in 1979?
Well, I would put a different nuance, Marshall, on your excellent question, which is this. Both Reagan and Trump took issue with the policies of their predecessors. There is this wonderful saying that we needed a Carter to get a Reagan. So Reagan saw problems with America in his time, not because there were problems with America, but because there were problems with the Democratic administrations that preceded him. I think the same thing is true with President Trump. What he criticizes is not characteristics of the American people or capabilities of America as a country. What he is criticizing in very sharp terms is the result of Democrat policies in the Obama years and in the Biden years. And he has shown in the first Trump administration, and he promises in the second Trump administration, exceptional results once those policies are reversed. So I'll give you an example. Economic policy. Trump believes very strongly, just as Reagan believed very, very strongly, in the fundamental conservative tenet that the economy will grow if you cut taxes and you cut regulation. And we saw it in the Reagan years where they cut taxes and there were all these economists saying this is a disaster, it will explode the deficit. Actually, the taxes paid for themselves and caused tremendous economic growth in the 6% range in the Reagan years. President Trump did the same thing. He cut taxes, he cut regulation. He had this rule for every regulation that you add, you need to cut 10 regulations that are already in the books. We had exceptional growth. We had inflation at 1.5% when Trump got out of office. So this is how I would answer your question. The criticism is not of America, but it's a sharp criticism of the policies of the Democrats, or progressives as Matt and I refer to them in our book.
And the key thing here, Matt, and this is where you could see ways that the Trump and then Reaganite critique could rhyme, is that what you're essentially arguing here is that if it's the 1980s or if it's the late 1970s, America is profoundly underrated in terms of its inherent national strengths, the opportunities ahead of it in the coming decade, and that you see that play out going into the 1990s and early 2000s. In what ways would you argue America is being severely underrated relative to its potential with the right mix of policies and approaches?
Yes, I think there are a lot of parallels between the period that led up to Reagan's election and the period we are in now. With the belief that the United States is in decline, that maybe our rivals are better. And so I think one of the ways we're maybe underrated, and we do have a chapter on American exceptionalism where we go through some of our strengths. But I do think that Reagan was fundamentally right, that the U.S. free enterprise system is the best machine ever invented for generating wealth and power, and that state-controlled economies just don't work over the long run. And I think this debate is back now, when you do have some people saying, well, America's democracy is dysfunctional, Congress is gridlocked, China has state-led capitalist model, Xi has a plan for 2049, we don't even know what's going to happen after November. And I think that's incorrect, that the U.S. System of free markets and free politics is still the best system ever invented for great power competition and for delivering for the American people. And so I do think that if we take the gloves off and compete, once again, the United States can outcompete its autocratic rivals.
And Dan, something I'm curious about, the other side of the question about how America was underrated in the late 70s and early 80s would be, in what ways do you think China is overrated in the same way that the Soviet Union was overrated during that same exact period? What is the sort of, let's say, the doomer view of China vis-a-vis the United States? In what way is that conception incorrect?
Well, China is a communist country. A lot of people gloss over it when they look at China. I think it is helpful also to refer to the People's Republic of China, and when we talk about their policy, to refer to the policy of the Chinese Communist Party, which has been ruling China since 1949. So it is a communist country. And it was the communist policies of Mao Zedong were obviously disastrous, where China was a desperately poor country. Under Deng Xiaoping, so that was about 30 years, 49 to 79, under Deng Xiaoping, they introduced elements of capitalism. But Deng Xiaoping never wanted to change the fundamental characteristic of China as a communist country. Let's not forget that Deng Xiaoping was in power when they killed 10,000 young people in Tiananmen Square. And he wanted just to buy their time and hide their strength while preserving the communist character of China. But those capitalist elements introduced in China during the Deng Xiaoping era caused an economic growth that was tremendous, and it was the envy of the world. They grew at 10%. But under Xi Jinping, they returned to more Maoist policies with greater state control and an increased role for the Communist Party in enterprises, and growth now is at 5% and going down, and they have severe problems. They are a communist country. Now, there is this thing about communism. It has never worked. Nowhere, on no continent, with no ethnicity, with no geography, with no point in history. One of the lines I like to throw in is, if the Germans couldn't make it work in East Germany, nobody can make it work. So, as Matt was saying earlier, it's the free enterprise system that has proven the greatest machine to produce prosperity, to produce freedom, because it unleashes the potential of free people to contribute to the idea that in China, 1.4 billion people take orders from one man is absurd. It didn't work in the Soviet Union. It will not work in China either.
Matt, what is interesting about the scholarly approach that you take to this book from a research and framework perspective is that the two of you clearly understand that what's interesting about 2020's foreign policy, in contrast to, let's say, the war on terror period in the 2000s and early 2010s, is that this is a mix of foreign and domestic policy. So if we're looking at the domestic side of things, and you two are foreign policy scholars and researchers, so this is a little out of your typical area, but in what ways will this competition, or let's say this like aim to victory over China, require that the United States take different approaches to its domestic political policy apparatus?
Well, thanks, Marshall, because we do have several chapters at the end that deal more with these issues that kind of bridge the domestic and foreign policy. So we do talk about border security and immigration. We also talk about energy security and climate change. And I think it comes back to the title of our book. The subtitle is We Win, They Lose, Republican Foreign Policy in the New Cold War. And we do think New Cold War works as a title. And you have some people saying, well, it's not exactly like the old Cold War. That's true. World War I was not exactly like World War II either, but they had enough similarities there, both world wars. And so we do think that we are in a new Cold War. And so if we're in a new Cold War, then that requires a certain seriousness of purpose. We talk in the book about how you have thousands, I think Dan probably knows the exact number, of Chinese military-age men coming across the U.S. border. I mean, imagine during the first Cold War, if there were Soviet military-age men streaming across the border that we didn't know who they were, it would be unacceptable. And so I think part of the reason that border security is important is because we are in a new Cold War. Similar when it comes to energy policy and climate change. Is the number one threat facing the country climate change, as the Biden administration says? Or is it, as Dan and I think, the threat from the Chinese Communist Party? And if it's the threat posed by the Chinese Communist Party, then giving away one of our greatest strengths, our energy security, in order to hand a win to China when it comes to EVs and these other technologies where China is basically trying to dominate the market, not because it cares about climate change per se, but because it wants to dominate 21st century technology, and our climate change policies are playing into China's hand. And so we argue that that doesn't make sense either, that climate change is a problem to be managed, but we need to do it in a way that preserves American strengths and that allows us to compete effectively with China.
Dan, I'm glad that Matt just brought up border security, because this is an area where you get into the more awkward parts of the Trump and then Reagan dynamic, because obviously no one, I think, of good faith is going to defend the situation at the border. But it's kind of interesting if you think of like Chinese military-aged men crossing into the border. Another way of framing that I've heard from folks who are interested in border security but are also thinking competition with China is that at the end of the day, the United States is an attractive country. And there's a variety of reasons why a young Chinese person, male or female, will be compelled to come here by any means with which they can. How should a Trumpist, Reaganite, fusionist Republican Party think of the issue of immigration in a competition sense?
Well, thank you, Marshall. Another excellent question. What Matt and I argue in our book is that we need to start the discussion on immigration from, as I mentioned earlier, the question of interests of the United States. What is in the interest of the American people regarding immigration? America exists. We have borders. Those borders need to be respected. People should not just be able to cross the border, show up, and our border agents become Uber drivers who take people from place to another, greeting committee, and so on. Matt was talking about the number of people coming from China. 30,000 people. There were 4,000 last year. Now there are 30,000 people, men of military age. In addition to that, there are people on a terrorist watch list who are coming in the United States, about 400 of them. And the Department of Homeland Security cannot tell us if the encounter resulted in those people being prevented from entering the United States or if they were released in the United States. We just don't know. Nine Islamic terrorists killed 3,000 Americans. How much more can 400? So what Matt and I propose in the book is the following thing: the recognition of the fact that the border has to be sealed. Simple. It's a foreign policy issue. It's a national security risk. It has to be done. But we also make the following point. America is a country where we had a melting pot, people coming from all over the world. Marshall, you put it very well. It's a very attractive country. We want people to come from around the world and contribute in America, make America better, richer, freer. That's fine, but it should be the American administration that decides who comes in the United States. And actually, Matt and I take a step further and say, and Marshall, you touched on this, in the competition with China, we want to make sure that the best and the brightest in the world come to America. And we should not just allow people to come here, but we should actively go and to recruit people who are exceptionally talented in the cutting edge areas of technology to make sure that they come here. But it has to start, the immigration policy has to start with securing the southern border. And right now it's not.
Matt, something I'm curious about, you two obviously make reference to the idea of isolationism, and what's difficult when it comes to cataloging isolationism versus openness and engagement is that no one wants to actually describe themselves as an isolationist. So it's easy to sort of wish it away with references to interests and realism. What would you say in a good, and you two accomplish this in the book, so I think you'll give a fair answer to this. But what would you say is the dividing line between the way that Trump has pushed the Republican Party in a direction that's clearly different than the 2015 consensus? What's the dividing line between that, which is just the reality of American politics, and actual isolationist ideas and policies that should be rejected as going too far in the opposite direction?
Yes, well, many people describe Trump as an isolationist, and I think that's not true. Look at the way he governed in his first term. He was very engaged in all the major regions, negotiating personally with Kim Jong-un, providing weapons to the Ukrainians for the first time, something that Obama was unwilling to do, using military force against Iranian General Soleimani. So I think it was an internationalist foreign policy. And then, others will say, well, he pulled out of all these agreements. But in all the cases, there was good reason. The Iran nuclear deal, for example, there was bipartisan opposition to the Iran deal. People often forget that. All the Republican candidates in 2016 said they were going to pull out of the deal. And then other people will point to trade wars as how he was isolationist. But getting tough with China on trade was the right thing to do. It took courage. I'm not sure a Rubio or a Clinton would have done that. And Biden has essentially continued that economic approach toward China. So I guess that would be my answer. I think this idea that Trump and his supporters are somehow isolationist is inaccurate.
And what would represent isolation? So what are some policies that one could fit into a Trump framework that you think would cross the line into actual isolationism?
Yeah, well, I think some of the things that would be isolationism would be, for example, if the United States did say, okay, we're abandoning NATO, we're pulling out, we're no longer a member, we're bringing our forces home. The Europeans can defend themselves. I think that would be an isolationist policy. I don't think that's Trump's policy. I don't think that's something that Trump would do, but I think that would be an isolationist policy. Or a similar thing in Asia. The competing in Asia is not in our interest. Let China take Taiwan. Why do we care what happens in Taiwan? Let's pull our forces out of Japan, out of Korea. So I think those kind of things would be isolationist, but again, I don't think that's what motivated Trump in his first term or what's motivating him now.
And Dan, in this last section, here's what I'd love to hear from you. Obviously, it's important that a book such as the two of yours begin with a clear articulation of American interests, obviously recognizing that at a rhetorical level, at a minimum, the balance between interests and values was skewed over the course of the past 30 years of Cold War policy. That said, I often find folks, especially on the right, who engage too much in interest and realist-based conversation, they kind of take it too far and it ends up sounding bloodless. I think at the end of the day, like, politics is a balancing act. And yes, it's important that we recognize that our defense industrial base is put under strain when it comes to Ukraine versus our interest in the Indo-Pacific. But at the end of the day, it doesn't seem like you're going to have a successful political program that's just based purely on, we have X number of artillery shells, we need to put them in Y place because we're just doing these things and turning different technocratic knobs. You have to be able to speak to ideas of democracy and value and motivation. The American people want interests, but I think they also care about, at the end of the day, that what we're doing is good and makes sense and represents something you want to feel good about in terms of our role in the world. So how do you advise any administration, left, right, or center, because everyone is trying to work through this interest versus values dynamic? How do you balance these things together in a way that could sustainably build political consensus?
Well, I mean, the question is, why do we do all these things and why do we have a foreign policy? And Matt and I mentioned in the book that the principles, the organizing principles for our foreign policy really go back to the Declaration of Independence, the foundational documents of America, what America is all about, and the Constitution, where we talk about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then we translate those wonderful words. And also, I think in the preamble of the Constitution, it starts by saying, we're creating a government in order to allow the people to live in freedom and in prosperity. That's why we have a government. So what is the purpose of the foreign policy? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Happiness, we say, is the prosperity. Liberty is freedom, and life is the security. So we are pursuing, Marshall, as you mentioned, the analysis of, do we have a strong military? And but the purpose of having a strong military is to defend the freedom of the American people and the prosperity of the American people. So we want America to continue to be a beacon for the world, to show what free people can accomplish. But in order to do that, we need to have a strong economy that supports a strong military, and together with our allies, provide deterrence to what we define in the book, what Matt and I call the new axis of evil of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea.
Final question that I will throw to the two of you. This is obviously the Arsenal of Democracy podcast, so we're very focused on the defense industrial base and America's capability when it comes to production, manufacturing, technological innovation, etc. If we're thinking of Reaganite terms that, regardless of whether you're left, right, or center, I think are going to resonate, it's this idea of peace through strength. And I think the arsenal of democracy is very much a key component of that. You want to deter conflict. You want to have the ability to win conflicts if you need to. What do you think a Trump administration would need to do in the context of this arsenal of democracy, defense, industrial based conversation that at this point, regardless of actual solutions, is clearly bipartisan as being this area where everyone wants to focus their attention on?
Yes. Well, in our chapter on peace through strength, we do conclude the chapter with some recommendations. And we have three major recommendations. One, we do think that the United States needs to increase defense spending. The Reagan buildup, of course, was important to winning the first Cold War. The Biden administration's defense budgets, essentially they're cutting defense after inflation. And so I would hope that a Trump administration, a Trump 2 administration, or a Harris administration would increase the defense budget, which is going to be, I think, necessary to revitalize the defense industrial base. We don't talk about this in the book, but I like Roger Wicker's proposal to go to 5% of GDP for U.S. defense spending. Second, we argue that to defend the free world, the allies are going to need to do more. And this isn't just, I think some in the media in the United States think this is a weird Trump obsession, but not at all. He's right. The allies are going to need to do more, even just to get the capabilities to implement the new NATO regional plans. And then third, we think, like in Reagan's time, that strategic forces and strategic deterrence are important. And I think Trump's instincts have been good here, too, talking about how we need a nuclear arsenal at the top of the pack. And he's been talking a lot recently about how the United States needs a homeland missile defense system, which he refers to as an Iron Dome. So that's what we'd recommend, and I think those things would help strengthen the arsenal of democracy.
Dan, would love your closing thoughts on the arsenal of democracy.
We are in a sobering time. Bob Gates, who was a distinguished public servant, said that this is the most dangerous time since the 1930s, where, and then other scholars commented on how disparate conflicts in different parts of the world in the prelude to the Second World War ended up in one conflagration. It is a time when the United States and the bloc of the freedom countries need to be very serious about national security. In the case of the United States, complicating this requirement that Matt touched on of increasing defense spending is that our national debt is very high and our budget deficits are chronic. So what a second Trump administration will have to do is make tough choices on prioritizing spending. And President Trump did allude to what he would do. So number one, he will cut a lot of the unspent money that was allocated for COVID. He will also immediately stop spending on the Green New Deal, where he believes, and we agree with him in our book, in our Energy and Climate chapter, that climate change is not an existential threat and it's not an urgent matter that needs to be dealt with. Is something that can be handled over time. There are trillions that can be saved there. That money needs to be redirected to strengthening our military. What the Ukrainian war has shown that, for example, munition production in the United States and in the West is inadequate. These are serious matters that we need to deal with. But since I'm providing the concluding comments with a very strong confidence that the free American people is going to prevail in this new Cold War, just like we prevailed in the First World War, Second World War, and in the previous Cold War.
Well, Dan and Matt, this has been a great conversation. The book is We Win, They Lose. Thanks for joining me on Arsenal of Democracy.
Thank you, Marshall. Excellent questions.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit subscribe below so you don't miss any episodes of Arsenal of Democracy. If you'd like to learn more about the topics covered on this episode, or just are interested in broader content on U.S. foreign and domestic policy, be sure to go to hudson.org. See you soon.